Whatever your child needs, you'll be right by his side. So isn't it good to know that the Children's Hospital, ranked best in the nation by U.S. News & World Report and Parents Magazine, is right by your side? The Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. Visit chop.edu/yourside.
Welcome to Just Energy Radio with your host, naturopath and medical intuitive, Dr. Rita Louise. We have learned from Einstein's theory that matter and energy are one. Physicists believe that all systems in nature have their own particular way of vibrating. From the swinging of a pendulum to the waves of the ocean to the light that brightens the sky each day, each of these oscillates at its own unique rate. The same holds true for every thought, feeling, event, or word we speak. Each has its own frequency or rate of vibration. What many of us don't realize is when we take everything in our universe down to its simplest form, it is all just energy. Join Dr. Rita Louise on a journey through time and space where past, present, and future collide. Today, what you believe may be called into question. What we want to know is, who made up the rules? Be brave and step outside the box. We are about to turn our world upside down and venture into the unknown. Hold on. We are departing our own beliefs and entering alternative realms. Enjoy the possibilities.
Hello and welcome to Just Energy Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Rita Louise, and thank you all for tuning into the show today. Great show. I'm really interested in where we're going to go because this is a topic that I don't think a lot of people talk about. We're going to be discussing the JFK assassination and the cancer-causing virus. And to do that, we're going to be speaking with Ed Haslam about his new book, Dr. Mary's Monkey. Just Energy Radio is brought to you by soulhealer.com, where you can find out about all the products and services I offer, including medical intuition evaluations, energy healings, and psychic readings. It's also brought to you by the Institute of Applied Energetics, where you can jumpstart your intuition today by downloading their free 50-page guide. That's AppliedEnergeticsInstitute.com. And if you haven't been by the Just Energy Radio webpage, please do stop by. We've been making a number of changes on the site. We are setting up a membership thing, which is allowing people to access all of our archives commercial free, like YouTube commercial free, which I think is great. And we're offering a 6-month free membership for people that sign up. So please stop by www.justenergyradio.com. Okay, let me tell you a little bit about Ed and get him on the air. Ed Haslam is a former advertising music director and writer. He is a member of the Society of Professional Journalists and Investigative Reporters and Editors, and is a former president of the Press Club of Fort Worth, Texas. His book is Dr. Mary's Monkey, and so is his webpage. So please welcome Ed Haslam. Hey, Ed, how you doing?
I'm doing good, Dr. Rita. Thank you.
Well, thanks for coming on the show. I have a lot of questions because the topic that you're bringing to the table, I've heard over the years, miscellaneous rumors and conjectures from different people, and you watch History Channel or some of those shows, and they talk about little pieces of what I think is going to unfold tonight. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Well, if I may make a suggestion, why don't you start by reading the title and subtitle for your audience?
Well, I can do that. The book is Dr. Mary's Monkey, How the Unsolved Murder of a Doctor, a Secret Laboratory in New Orleans, and Cancer-Causing Monkey Virus are linked to Lee Harvey Oswald, the JFK assassination, and emerging global epidemics. Well, see, now that's the entire show. We can go and, have a beer now.
Yeah, that sums it up.
Pretty much. But let's start here. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, because you haven't been on the show before, and what brought you to writing this book in the first place?
Well, let me ask you a question. Do we have a cancer epidemic today?
We do.
Right. And when was the first time you heard those words, cancer epidemic?
I do I do alternative healthcare.
Right.
And so, I mean, I've been watching this for years, and then in the last few years, it has gone crazy. It
Right.
just seems like everybody and their brother is developing cancer, young and old. It used to be an old person disease, not anymore.
Well, I speak in public fairly frequently, and one of the questions I always ask the audience is, if you don't have someone in your friend and family circle with cancer, please raise your hand. And nobody ever raises their hand because it's ubiquitous. We are in the middle of a cancer tsunami. When I first published my book 20 years ago as Mary Ferry and the Monkey Virus, nobody was talking about cancer epidemic, and I kind of introduced the terminology into it, and people, rolled their eyes at me and told me I was crazy and everything else, and cancers could not be caused by viruses. But here we are in 2015, and the farmers are out marketing the HPV vaccine to stop the human papilloma virus from causing various types of cancer, the cervical
but don't
cancer.
even get me started on that whole thing.
Okay, but what I'm saying is the farmers cannot take the position that they took for almost 50 years, which was cancers cannot be caused by viruses, because they're out there marketing products based on that assumption. Okay, so they have, kind of cut the limb off between them and the tree. And what we have here is the question: if we have a cancer epidemic today, after all this wonderful medicine and research, billions of dollars on cancer research, everything else, the logical and obvious question is, where did it come from? And that's what I get into in my book. I mean, my book, I start off by researching the murder of a doctor who happened to be a cancer researcher. The only reason I was interested in this woman was somebody who was close to my family. I sat on her lap once as a child. She was a professor of orthopedic surgery at Tulane Medical School and ran a cancer laboratory over at Ochsner Clinic. She and my father were good friends and professional colleagues, and they would go to the orthopedic meetings together. And my father was out of Harvard Medical School. I mean, he was no slouch. And she was out of the University of Chicago. And my father had the utmost respect for her because she was not only a respected orthopedic surgeon across the country, even internationally, but she was published in the peer-reviewed journals in both cancer and radiation. Now, cancer and radiation, those two ideas play a big role in this story. And so when she was murdered in 1964, it was big news in our house because she was one of my father's best friends. And what I love about, the organic nature of society is they have grapevines and stuff like that. And you start to hear things through the verbal channel that you don't read in the printed page. And I started to hear things about what happened to Mary Sherman that the public was never told. And my mother told me very bluntly that the whole investigation into her murder was shut down from the top. And so, I was left with a lot of questions from the time I was a child about what happened to, Daddy's friend. And 28 years after her death, I went to the public library and I got a hold of the official records. I got the autopsy report and the police reports and the homicide reports and all of the newspaper articles. And so, I got this big stack of stuff and I put them in pile A, which is the official documents, and pile B, which is the media stuff. And when I got finished reading both of those piles, I realized the public was never told what really happened to Mary Sherman. They were told, her naked body was found in her apartment. It had been stabbed 7 or 8 times and set on fire. Kinky sex slashing type scenario. And then the next day they say, but she was not raped. And And they start to bring in, there was no burglary motive, and the jewel box is still there. And, and they start bringing out all these details, which said, something's wrong with this picture. And then when I finally got into the autopsy reports, they told me that this woman's entire right arm and rib cage, okay, we're talking about from the fingertips up to the shoulder and down to the hip bone, was disintegrated by heat.
I looked at the pictures that were in the book. Thank God they were in black and white, because I think it would have been kind of disgusting. And, just based on that little observation, my take was the only way she could get like that was something really weird, which I can understand why it would raise your curiosity. But the first thing that came to mind was like spontaneous human combustion, because I've only seen, something like that in the few cases of people that have spontaneously combusted and lived. Except she didn't live because there was too much gone. Because the damage was so isolated. It wasn't all over her body as if she had been in a fire.
Well, the other thing is, if you show those pictures to an electrical engineer who works with high voltage, they'll say that's an arc flash burn. It's very common in high voltage electrocutions. And what happens is the temperatures are so high that the water inside the bones explode and disintegrate the body. And the interesting point about this, and particularly I've had people raise the spontaneous combustion things before, which I know nothing about, but it occurs to me that why is this only in the right arm and rib cage? And that is evidence of a high voltage burn, either directly from electricity or from radiation. Now, the point is, once you get your head around that, and you say, all right, well, what does the rest of the apartment look like? Well,
that would be, I can't even imagine how you could have that kind of a burn in an apartment that, we only have, 220 coming in.
Well, you put your finger on the nerve there. There's nothing in her apartment that could have possibly caused the burns on her body. Nothing in her apartment. Therefore, she did not receive the burns to her body in her apartment. She was electrocuted somewhere else, and they brought her body back to her apartment, and they faked a murder scene.
But let me ask just a question on that. In the police reports, was there any blood or anything on the carpet under her body, or was her body there just kind of there?
The photo of her apartment where with her body laying on the rug, and after they have removed her body laying on the rug, clearly shows that the curtains next to her bed did not burn. The books on her nightstand did not burn. The carpet under her bed did not burn. There's a little bit of soot on the walls, but there's no blood anywhere. There's nothing in her apartment the toaster didn't burn off her arm. There's nothing in her apartment that could have possibly done the damage to her body. And once you realize that single point, and looking at all the evidence and asking all the logical questions, you realize that she was electrocuted somewhere else. And they brought her body back to her apartment, and they faked a murder scene, which is why they never told the press her arm was missing. Now, this is the main forensic fact in the case. This is like not mentioning that Nicole Simpson's throat got cut. That would be grossly inaccurate reporting if they had forgotten to tell the public that. Right? The same thing with this. They did not tell the public that Mary Sherman's right arm and rib cage was missing. They just went to all the psychosexual angles of the case and tried to create a story that was so horrible that everybody would take 3 steps back from, and they'd run around town looking for a lesbian sex slasher instead of looking for the real place where she got her arm burned off. And, in other words, let me just take all the varnish off this. They did not want people running around uptown New Orleans looking for a 5 million volt electrical machine that could have burned off Mary Sherman's arm, because they didn't want them to find it. And I eventually found it. And that becomes, this story as you go through, this is not a one-trick pony. This is a glass onion that keeps, opening up and opening up and opening up. And what we find is this machine on federal property. But, before you get there, you got to say, well, who are these people? Where's this woman from? Who does she work for? What does she know? All this stuff. And you get into the fact that Mary Sherman, who's the woman with her arm burned off, Dr. Mary Sherman, MD out of the University of Chicago, works for Dr. Alton Ochsner, who's the founder of the Ochsner Clinic. He was also a rabid anti-communist and has a 40-year history of covert assignments for the U.S. military, and was one of the stockholders of one of the major labs producing the polio vaccines. He's also the former president of the American Cancer Society. Do you see a certain amount of medical power lining up here? Okay, this is very high-level stuff. Well, Ochsner, who was president of the Cancer Society in the late 1940s, sat on the board with Wild Bill Donovan, who's basically, bottom line, founder of the CIA. He ran the Office of Strategic Services, which was military intelligence during World War II. And in 1947, they went to set up the CIA. The first thing they did was they went to Wild Bill Donovan and said, how do we do this? What do we do this? What do we need to put in place for legal protection and all that other stuff? And Donovan was basically the architect of the CIA. And he's sitting on the board of directors of the American Cancer Society with Dr. Alton Ochsner. And then, but this whole story goes back to polio and the polio vaccine. And this is the part that nobody ever expected anybody to dig up. All right. And what you're into alternative health, you understand about the cancer epidemic, which has exploded since the polio vaccine. Your listeners would probably be interested in knowing that the polio vaccine was grown on the kidney cells of monkeys. And when they made the vaccine, they got all the viruses that were in the monkey's kidney cells in the vaccine.
And so do you know how that process works as far as creating a vaccine? Because, it almost sounds homeopathic, where you take the contagion or the bacteria and then you use that to heal somebody. Is that basically the process of what they were trying to do?
Well, the concept of the vaccine, going back to the smallpox vaccine, the word vaccination, vaca, means cow, okay? And it was cowpox they were trying to prevent against. And they learned from a African witch doctor, basically, that if you took a small amount of the pus from the pox and inoculated it into the skin of a child, it would prevent them from getting the big disease. All right. And this was done, Jenner in England in the late 1700s, Cotton Mather in Massachusetts around the same time. There's a history to this. OK. And the concept of a vaccine was, grew out of folk medicine. Originally, it's not a white man's trick, It was something that grew out of that folk medicine tradition, and the concept was, and there's a why behind this concept, which we'll get to in a minute. But the concept was, if you put a little bit of this virus in the body, the immune system will respond to it and develop a defense, an antibiotic, but when you stop and say, well, wait a second, how does polio really work? Polio is a virus. It goes in the mouth, out the bottom, and in 99.99% of all cases, it does not cause disease. Okay? Why? Because the intestinal lining protects the body. It goes in one end, out the other, does not cause disease. So you're left with the question of why does that 1/10 to 1/100th of 1% of the people who get exposed to this virus get polio?
That's a great question.
Okay. And the point is, polio, in 1909, Karl Landsteiner did an autopsy on a kid in Austria who had died of polio. And he took him apart and he discovered his brain looked really weird. And he took some of the brainstem matter and put it through a filter and injected it into a monkey. And sure enough, the monkey got the same disease and died. Okay. And so Landsteiner says, this is caused by a virus. But he did not say, this is caused by a virus that got into the bloodstream and then got into the brain. So how does the virus get from your intestines into your bloodstream? All right.
Because you have perforation in the intestines or a weak lining.
Exactly. You either have parasites, which are disrupting the intestinal wall, or you have a flora imbalance in there, such as candida, et cetera, which is eating the intestinal wall and allowing leaky gut things to go on. And so what happens when they come out, you have to ask yourself, all right, they did a polio vaccine. Everybody was scared to death of polio, blah, blah, blah. Why did we have a polio epidemic in the first place? When did it happen? The polio epidemic, you get the CDC graphs, and it goes back to 1900, okay? Early part of the century, they got 2,000-3,000 cases a year, okay? And that pretty much goes on throughout the 30s, so it increases a little bit in the 30s. 1916, very strange thing. They have 27,000 cases of polio, right? 2,000 the year before, 2,000 the year after, and 27,000 cases in 1916. What's going on in 1916? Well, Karl Landsteiner, the same guy that discovered the polio virus, also developed blood typing. And in 1916, they started using refrigerated bloods in hospital, and they started inoculating people with blood with the polio virus in it. And they had a sudden massive outbreak right in front of them. It didn't take them long to figure out what it is. And they changed their policies back at the hospital, which is why there is no ramp up and no ramp down, which is what you see in all epidemiology. Okay? So this cooks along 2,000 to 3,000 cases, maybe 4,000 or 5,000 cases in the 1930s. There are issues here like decline in breastfeeding, blah, blah, blah. And then in 1943, it explodes. It goes from 2,000 or 3,000 cases a year to over 10,000, over 20,000, over 30,000, over 40,000, over 50,000, right? The polio epidemic starts in 1943. So what happens?
But I thought it was like eliminated by then.
No.
No, huh?
No, if you believe the numbers from the CDC and stuff, it just does not go down seriously until the late 50s. And the polio vaccine gets released in April of 1955. Okay, so what happens is they introduced penicillin to clinical medicine all across the United States in 1942. The explosion of polio is a quid pro quo, a direct response to the introduction of antibiotics.
But that makes sense. That makes total sense.
Yes.
All right, so for the people that are listening, antibiotics kill all of the good flora that's in the gut and makes your gut more susceptible. So that, so if it's coming in through the gut lining, polio, that works for me. If that's
let me tweak the language a little bit.
Okay.
Antibiotics kill bacteria, right? And they kill good bacteria and bad bacteria. They don't kill viruses or funguses or stuff like that. They kill bacteria, all right? And so the reason that they are such a popular drug and were claimed to be miraculous is you could take somebody with syphilis or gonorrhea or pneumonia and inject them with a syringe, and all of a sudden they're cured. Okay. Now, that is a major development in medicine, and everyone went around, particularly the pharmaceuticals who were selling this stuff, promoting the marvelous ability of this to happen. And I'll get into where this comes from and who developed it and why and all this other stuff in a minute. But the basic point is, because something has a huge positive impact in certain cases does not mean it does not have negative side effects. Okay, and Fleming.
Well, they don't understand that today because, you go to the doctor and you leave with either an antibiotic or an antidepressant, but that's probably a different conversation than what we're having here.
Well, it's pretty close, I went to a doctor once and he said, "You have a virus, here are some antibiotics." And I said, "Time out, doc." Antibiotics don't cure viruses. Why are you offering it to me? And he said, "Oh, some people like to have antibiotics when they leave the doctor's office." At any rate, so I'm and this is radio. I'm doing my virtual eye roll on that one. Okay. And when you get back to where did this penicillin come from? Well, Alexander Fleming got the Nobel Prize for developing a penicillin, but there's more to the story than that. You go back to World War I. And this was right when Karl Landsteiner was working on the blood groups, because these soldiers would go out on the front lines in World War I, they'd get shot, and they'd lose a lot of blood. They'd put somebody else's blood in there. They did not understand blood compatibility. They were killing the soldiers with blood transfusions. And if that didn't kill them, if you got shot anywhere between the hip and the throat in World War I, you were going to die. And the reason you were going to die was infection, okay? And Fleming was a doctor on the front line during World War I who watched this day in and day out. You cannot imagine anybody more frustrated than a doctor with everybody dying in his hands because they didn't have the tools to stop it. And Fleming even said they were killing as many soldiers with their attempted treatments of antiseptics and stuff like that as were succumbing to infection. All right. So when the war was over, Fleming asked some really basic questions that were profound in their nature. And he said, the body has natural defenses. How do they work? We know nothing about this. I mean, your eyes, for example, are part of the inside of your body that are poking out of these little eyelids. And they're exposed to germs and everything else. Why don't they get infected on a regular basis? I mean, what does the eye have that prevents the eye from getting infected? And so after the war in about 1929, he's doing this research at St. Mary's in London. And, he sitting there by his petri dish eating a sandwich. And he's kind of a messy eater, and some of the bread from his sandwich gets into the petri dish. And he closes the petri dish and he goes on vacation for a month. And he comes back from vacation, he opens up the petri dish and, whoa, look at this. All the bacteria is dead. The mold from the bread has grown and eaten the bacteria. He accidentally discovers the principle that molds can kill bacteria, which is the whole foundation of all antibiotics. Okay. And so he writes this paper about this, thinks it's a important breakthrough, and like most important breakthroughs, it sits there on the shelf for 13 years. Now, what's happening 13 years later is Britain knows there's going to be another war with Germany. And they know the horrible situation of the frontline medical thing they had last time. And they start looking around for a solution. And they come up with this, they find this paper that this unknown doctor in London wrote 13 years before, and they take it over to Oxford, and they bring together 5 or 6 of their best chemists and people, and they say, there's a pony in here somewhere. This guy's onto something, but he was not able to make it work. You guys figure it out. And so for the next 3 years, they turn Fleming's mold into what we now call penicillin. Okay. it is now, at that point in time, they can put it in a syringe and inject it into somebody with a horrible bacteria-based disease, and within 24 hours, the person's cured. They know they have their hands on the most important discovery in modern medicine. And they know they're about to go into a war where there's going to be a lot of frontline casualties. And they want to produce this new miracle drug in enormous quantities for the use for the military. The problem is they're in England, and this is the late 1930s. And England is being bombed by the Germans. And if they try to build a large new factory, the Germans will simply bomb it, and they won't be able to produce their medicines. So the British turn to the Americans, and you cannot overstate the cooperation between Britain and America at this point in time. I mean, Winston Churchill and the royal family were staying at the White House, and they drink champagne all night and plan the bombing of German cities. It was during this time that the British turned to the Americans and said, we have the wonder drug. We have something that cures infections that can be injected. The problem is we cannot produce it in large quantities right now because of the pressure from the German Air Force. We will give you, the Americans, the science, if you build the factory and give us the medicine. That's the deal that is cut. And it's cut right on the eve of World War II. Okay? So the Americans, they start using the British technique. And finally, somebody on the American side says, hey, this is a lot like making beer. Let's get a big vat, like a beer vat, the way you make Budweiser or something, and start making penicillin. And so all of a sudden, huge quantities of penicillin becomes available to American medicine in 1942 because the Americans are mass producing it for the British. Okay? This is all military industrial complex stuff, right? This is medicine being done by the military for the troops, basically, for the war effort. And so
this wasn't even being done through the pharmaceutical companies that existed at the time.
No, it was brought to them as caretakers and said, make this stuff, okay? And they started making it using beer technology, basically. But in 1942, the antibiotics are introduced all across the country. I mean, it didn't start in New York and slowly grow. It's just New York, LA, San Francisco, Miami, New Orleans, all across the country, all at the same time in 1942. And what happens, as we said, this wonderful drug that cures syphilis and gonorrhea and stuff also kills the intestinal flora, particularly the acidophilus probiotic families. And there's a balance that goes on in the intestine. And the balance is between the probiotic bacteria, like the acidophilus, and candida, which is a yeast or a fungus, depending on how you classify. I think it's technically a fungus. And the probiotic bacteria eats the fungus and keeps it under control. And when it is under control in the lower intestines, it produces things like vitamin B12 and stuff like that. It's got some positive role. But the moment you get rid of the acidophilus that's mowing the lawn, if you will, then the weeds start growing. Okay, it starts growing out of control. And when it grows out of control, the roots start digging into the intestinal wall, and it starts eroding the protective lining of the intestines. And then you have stuff like food particles and viruses and everything else that are in the intestines and are supposed to stay in the intestines are now getting through the intestinal wall into the blood supply. Okay? And it's only at that time, once that stuff goes through the intestinal wall, it's only at that time that it matters whether or not there's an immune response in the blood. Okay? If the virus does not get past the intestinal wall, it does not matter whether the person has an immune response. So either the pharmas have to greatly restrict the use of antibiotics to the life-threatening diseases and stuff, or they have to push for a vaccine. Well, if they greatly restrict the most popular and successful drug in American history, or the history of the world, frankly, they're not going to sell a lot of it. Okay, so you have a money issue here. And so pushing for a vaccine, which is what they did with huge amounts of money, and then we're talking about Rockefeller kind of money, all right? Huge amounts of money and huge hysteria in the press. They buy off all kind of people. America is terrorized in the 1950s by polio. And they even anthropomorphize it, saying polio is stalking your children. You know, I mean, polio is not stalking your children, and your children are not going to get polio, providing they're healthy and have a decent intestinal lining. But if they're sitting around drinking Coca-Cola and taking antibiotics and
eating a ton of sugar and junk.
And the sugar is a really important point, because the Candida albicans loves sugar, and it turns it into a cousin of formaldehyde, which poisons the body. I mean, you know, don't get me started on that one. I'm a soapbox evangelist and all that stuff. Well, what happens to the political media environment is that there's this huge push for the vaccine. And there is this debate going on between Jonas Salk and Albert Sabin on what to do with the polio vaccine. And in order to understand this, you need to know that there are 3 flavors of polio. I'm just going to call them heavy, medium, and light. Okay. Well, heavy is the only one that kills and cripples. So Jonas Salk said, well, all you got to do is kill heavy, you know? And if you kill heavy by drowning it in formaldehyde, then we can now inject your children with a dead monkey virus. And it can't cause a disease because it's dead, but your body will know that it's strange and it doesn't belong in there. So your body will develop an immune response to it. And Albert Sabin said, you don't need to mess around with that dangerous thing. You use polio light. It doesn't kill or cripple. And, you know, you just inject it into it live and stuff. And so there's this big debate, and Jonas Salk wins the debate, okay, or the people behind him, which are all out of Pittsburgh. This is all Steele money. I mean, you got to trace the money and all this stuff to figure out where it's coming from, because, you know, little doctors with good ideas don't change medicine. It's big money that changes medicine. So, and they start testing this thing in the early 50s without parental consent. I mean, I know a woman who contacted me, and she said, I got polio on my 8th birthday, which was the day after I got the polio vaccine, which was in 1952. I know how old I am. And you go back and read the history, you say, wait a second, this thing wasn't approved until 55. That's right. They were testing it on school children without their permission prior to the release. And the results of all those tests get published by the March of Dimes people, fancy names for it, but it's March of Dimes people, at the University of Michigan in April of 1955. And when they release it, they said, this thing is proven. It is safe. It is effective. It works. Roll up your sleeves and get ready for your vaccines. And they have all these lines of children rolling up their sleeves and stuff. And at this point in time, they turn to Dr. Bernice Eddy, MD, PhD, who is the official vaccine safety tester for the National Institutes of Health. And they say, Dr. Eddy, it's time for you to approve the vaccine. And she takes their vaccine back and she injects it into her monkeys, and she gets back dead and crippled monkeys. And she says, you know, guys, there's a problem with this vaccine. And if you release it the way it is right now, you're going to kill and cripple children. And they blow up at her. They think she's just creating all this red tape to delay the, you know, I mean, from their point of view, 125 kids a day are getting polio. You know, they want to get this thing out there to stop that. even though they don't really want to discuss why 125 kids a day are getting polio. At any rate, Bernice Eddy says, well, here's the good news. All the problem, there are 6 manufacturers. The problem is coming out of one batch of vaccine, and that batch is made by Cutter Laboratories. And if you could get Cutter Laboratories to back off on their batch, then we could release the rest of it. And so they contact the major stockholder of Cutter Laboratories, who is Dr. Alton Ochsner in New Orleans, Mary Sherman's boss, and say, the people up at NIH are having a problem with your vaccine. And he is this, arch conservative guy who just thinks there's some bureaucrat in the government throwing red tape in his face at the last minute. He is so adamant about this that he's chief of surgery at the time at Tulane Medical School, where my father and Mary Sherman both teach. And he calls the faculty into the amphitheater and says, look, there's a controversy over the polio vaccine. And I want you to know that I think it's safe. I've known Jonas Salk for 20 years. I've been following this. I knew Carl Landsteiner. He taught me how to type blood. And I think, and I've invested heavily in this because I believe in it. And I would never ask you to do anything that I'm not willing to do myself. So here are my grandchildren. Here's my grandson and my granddaughter. And right here, right now, I'm going to inoculate them with Jonas Salk's polio vaccine, which he does. And in 48 hours, his grandson is dead and his granddaughter has polio.
Holy crap. I guess that was a failure.
Well, it proves he was sincere, I hate to be at that Thanksgiving dinner table. But that's what happens in 56. I mean, Ochsner kills his own grandchildren. And what does not get mentioned in Ochsner's biography, I only know this because I met a doctor in New Orleans who worked in the ER at Ochsner's hospital, and they worked one day on, one day off. And it just so happens that this happened on the day that he was off. Okay. So his buddy who worked on the on days was running the ER when Ochsner's grandson came in, and he gave the kid mouth to mouth to try to resuscitate him. And the doctor himself died of polio within 24 hours. And that does not get mentioned in Ochsner's biography, even though the rest of the stuff does. So what you've got here is you've got a man, Dr. Alton Ochsner, founder of one of the largest medical centers in America, former president of the American Cancer Society, stockholder in Cutter Laboratories, which manufactured the faulty polio vaccine, at the center of all of this. And the moment this Cutter thing happens, they fire Oveta Hobby, who is the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, the first woman ever appointed to the presidential cabinet. She was the wife of the governor of Texas. And they fire her and the entire management of NIH. And this is all going on during the Eisenhower-Nixon administration. And, Ike's busy running the Cold War, and he tells Nixon, get this stuff straightened out. Go kick ass, take names, fire people, and get new people in there. We promised the public a polio vaccine, and they don't have it. And we're going to look really ridiculous if we can't come up with one. So, Nixon and his people go back, and the other alternative was Sabin. And they come back with Sabin's vaccine, which uses polio light. And that starts off with an injection. Now, what happens with an injection is you don't have the benefit of the barrier of the intestinal lining. It's going straight into the blood supply. Even if it's just subcutaneous, it's going through the lymph system and stuff, and then into the blood supply. And so, and that eventually becomes a sugar cube that millions of people got, right? 200 million people. And so after they had already produced and distributed 200 million doses of the polio vaccine, and 100 million Americans had received the polio vaccine.
So are we talking heavy or light?
Both. But,
Okay.
but most of it is light at this point, but by far the worst was the heavy. But remember, they're injecting the heavy and they're injecting the light before the sugar cube, all right?
Mhm.
So what happens is two researchers up at the National Cancer Institute by the names of Bernice Eddy, who I've already mentioned, and Sarah Stewart. Now, Sarah Stewart was this unusual woman who had this weird idea that cancers were caused by viruses. And she was just determined to prove this. And in 1957, she and Bernice Eddy.
Whatever your child needs, you'll be right by his side. So isn't it good to know that the Children's Hospital, ranked best in the nation by U.S. News and World Report and Parents Magazine, is right by your side? The Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. Visit chop.edu/yourside.
Did some experiments at the National Cancer Institute, which proved that their virus was causing multiple types of cancer in multiple mammals, mostly hamsters and stuff like that. And when that happened, Congress said, you need money, here's the money. They started funding everything in sight. All the universities started getting electron microscopes. The war on cancer was on. And they started cataloging all of the viruses that were in the monkey labs, okay? And they finally find the natural host for this virus that's causing all the cancer. They originally named this virus polyoma. Poly meaning many, oma meaning tumors. Of course, it causes different types of tumors in different mammals, okay? When they figure out what this virus actually is, they rename it SV40. S stands for simian. That's a scientific term for monkey. So it's really monkey virus number 40, but they call it simian virus number 40. And they track it down to its natural host, which is the rhesus monkey. Now, the reason that's really, really bad news is that it was the kidney cells of the rhesus monkey that they used to manufacture the polio vaccine. And so 200 million doses of the polio vaccine distributed in the late 1950s were contaminated with a cancer-causing monkey virus named SV40. Now, once you get to that point, and I remember sitting on the sofa reading this book called The Health Century, where there was a chapter on these women in there, and I said, wait a second. They're telling us that there's going to be a cancer epidemic after the polio vaccine. Was there one?
Do you know, like, during what time window the contaminated vaccines were given out?
Yeah, between 55 and 63.
Okay, well, that's not good.
And the really sad part about this is they knew all this by 58. Okay, they allowed another 100 million doses of this contaminated vaccine to be distributed over the next 3 years because they did not want to tell the people why we are withdrawing the vaccine because we just inoculated your children with a cancer-causing virus.
Well, wasn't the spin on it, though, that they had cured polio and no one has it anymore, and so we don't need to give out the vaccine anymore? Same with smallpox?
Well, that was later.
Oh, okay.
I mean, but they kept giving out, it was after the first 100 million that they discovered the problem. And they knew it was in the second 100 million, and they kept giving out the second 100 million from about 1960 to 1963. So I
mean, that's just such a flagrant disregard of human life.
But the question I asked when I ran across this was, well, wait a second. They're saying there's going to be a cancer epidemic. Was there a cancer epidemic? So I went to the NCI statistics. I went over to the medical library. I got the librarian. I said, I'm looking for these statistics. And she brought back this page, and I brought them home, put them on my spreadsheet, made some graphs and stuff. And they're clear as day. We have an eruption of 4 soft tissue cancers, breast, prostate, melanoma, and lymphoma that erupts right after the polio vaccine. And the other one that should have been in that was childhood brain cancer, but that one happened so fast that it had leveled off a little bit. It's kind of a technical statistics thing. But there were really 5 cancers. And the thing about soft tissue, particularly brain cells, is the faster the cell turns over, the more likely it is to create a tumor, which is why you see these tumors first in these soft tissues, particularly in the brain tissues. So we got back 15 to 20 cases of cancer for each case of polio per year.
Okay, so I'm not understanding what the correlation between people with cancer and the people with polio is, what the relationship is.
No, it's people who got the polio vaccine, got the cancer-causing virus, and they're the ones with the cancer.
Mm-hmm. But didn't everybody get the polio vaccine at one point in time? Wasn't it kind of a mandatory thing that kids got?
More or less, yes. And what happens, it's just like the HPV thing. This is the line from the farmers, okay? They say 100% of the cases of HPV of cervical cancer caused by HPV, but only 1 out of 200 people who are infected with HPV get the cervical cancer. 1 out of 200, okay? That's 1/2 of 1%. We have 300 million people in this country. 1/2 of 1% of 300 million is 1.5 million people, and that's how many new cases of cancer we have each year. I mean, it's right on the mathematical model.
Mm-hmm.
And it's astronomically higher than it used to be. Okay, and there were cancers like pleural mesotheliomas. They had 4 or 5 cases per year in the United States before the polio vaccine, and now they've got about 2,500 to 3,000 cases a year. You know, it's where's it coming from? And why don't people want to admit it? I mean, this.
Well, I think it's a very interesting topic that you're bringing up in this connection, which I'm going to make a comment to it, but my thought was part of it has to do with, how we treat our bodies, which since the 50s, we've had like TV dinners and Popeyes and fast food and I have added to my little repertoire of, diseases is neglect, where we just don't take care of ourselves, and I always thought that was where this rampant thing of cancer has come from. I never thought that it was something that was given to us.
Well, a couple of thoughts on that. First of all, I'm going to agree with you 100% that the best thing you can do to prevent your body from getting cancer is to take care of your immune system, right? No ifs, ands, or buts about it. And that's got to do with diet and neglect and proper vitamins and stuff like that. And I'm a big fan of all that. And a lot of the experts will tell you that the typical human has cancer 5 or 6 times in their life. It's just the immune system takes care of it, okay? But underneath that thing of, it's color television, it's TV dinners, it's all that. Underneath that is the blame the patient strategy, okay? And if you blame the patient, you don't have to blame the pharmaceuticals, all right? And the idea that we have the wealthiest, most sophisticated, technically advanced society in the history of the world, which is why we have the most disease, does not track in my brain.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's another issue, and I really think the contamination of the polio vaccine, and when you get into it, the next layer on this thing, this stuff is sexually transmitted laterally from male to female and female to male, and it's also transmitted through the generations from mother to baby, and we're finding it in SV40. We're finding it in the grandchildren of the people who received the polio vaccine. And when you're looking at...
wait a minute, stop. So like STD, this SV40 is sexually transmitted? So yes. Like through a protein base in the body?
Well, they
don't even talk about it.
I know that's the whole point of controlling the media. They don't want it talked about. But if you look at some of the Italian studies on this, they surveyed a bunch of sexually active, otherwise healthy Italian males, and they found SV40 in, I think it was 45% of the semen. You know? And Russell Blaylock, who's a wonderful doctor, I'm sure you're aware of who he is, has researched this, and he's the one who comes up with this thing. We're finding it in the grandchildren of the polio vaccine recipients. You know, the dimensions of this story are absolutely horrible, you know.
But I think it's interesting because, you know, the method of control would be what you would do with someone that was HIV positive. You know, you would have conversations about, you know, sex and whatever, but they're not even doing anything to acknowledge it, much less control it. So I could just see where everybody ends up with it, and then we're all screwed.
Well, and in the next hour, we can talk about HIV a bit. Because remember, this is a book about the Kennedy assassination, right?
Yeah, I know. I was like, well, maybe we could get back to the Kennedys in the second hour. So why don't we have 5 minutes before we go to break? I mean, so is there a relationship with HIV?
I think there's a good relationship there, but you have to lay out some of the technical issues in order to understand it. You see, when they were making the polio vaccine, these rhesus monkeys are from Asia, okay? And they were putting them in cages with African monkeys, African greens, okay? And the monkeys all cross-contaminate each other. So what you wind up with is Asian monkeys that have African viruses in them. All right? Now, once you realize that there is a SV40 in this sauce, that's the vaccine, right? And you say, well, you know, we had polio heavy, medium, and light. All we got is SV40 heavy. Can't we get it to mutate into something we can use for a vaccine? How are we going to get it to mutate? How do you get something to mutate when you're in a hurry? How about radiation? We're going to put this puppy in front of a gamma ray radiation beam produced by a linear particle accelerator manufactured by High Voltage Engineering in Boston, Massachusetts, and later Pasadena, California. And we're going to set up this medical Manhattan project way away from Bethesda, way down in New Orleans, on federal property, and we're going to start roasting the polio vaccine with radiation in order to mutate the SV40 so that we can get a benign strain that we can use to produce a vaccine to stop the epidemic of cancer, which is being caused by the contamination of the polio vaccine. And this is what they do in 6061. Okay, they set up this medical Manhattan project on the grounds of the U.S. Public Health Service Hospital in New Orleans, right near Tulane's main campus, right near Dr. Alton Oshner's house, right near Mary Sherman's apartment. And they bring in all these high voltage specialists from out of town, I mean, literal high voltage specialists and heavyweight scientists who are involved in biological weapons. And in fact, there's this guy, Dr. Jose Rivera, MD, PhD, who ran MacArthur's lab in Japan when they were debriefing the Japanese scientists on their bioweapons and stuff. And so we find him at Fort Detrick one year running some big project over there. And then 2 years later, we find him as the head of neurology and blindness at the National Institutes of Health. And in between those 2 years, we find him in New Orleans teaching introductory biology to a bunch of undergraduate students at Loyola University, 1 mile from the linear particle accelerator. That's a cover job.
And so this work that they were doing, and we just have like 2 minutes, but this work that they were doing wasn't necessarily designed as a biological weapon. It just ended up being that. Correct?
Well, what they started out doing was they're trying to develop a vaccine to stop SV40. Okay, that's good. That's a good.
Yeah, well, it's like at least they didn't start with sinister intentions, which would be really bad.
That's right. And there's two problems here. The first problem is when you shoot a beam of gamma ray radiation through a test tube that's got both SIV and SV40 in it, you hit both the SIV and the SV40. And for those who don't recognize SIV, that's a simian immunodeficiency virus. That's the ancestor to the human immunodeficiency virus, which is the cause of AIDS. So that's the first problem. The second problem is in 1962, you've got Russian missiles in Cuba aimed at...
Okay, but you know what? Save that for after the break, because there's the music, okay?
Okay.
Okay, we're here talking to Edward Haslam about his book, Dr. Mary's Monkey. His webpage is drmarysmonkey.com, and we'll be back after these words from our sponsors.
Just Energy Radio with your host, Dr. Rita Louise, will return right after these messages. And now back to Just Energy Radio with Dr. Rita Louise.
Hello and welcome back to Just Energy Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Rita Louise, and we've been here talking to Ed Haslam about his book, Dr. Mary's Monkey, How an Unsolved Murder of a Doctor, a Secret Laboratory in New Orleans, and a Cancer-Causing Monkey Viruses are linked to Lee Harvey Oswald, the JFK assassination, and emerging global epidemics. I don't know how they got all of that onto the front of this book, but they did. And I just want to remind you, if you haven't signed up for your free 6-month membership on Just Energy Radio, it's a great time to do it. We're getting all of our archives put onto YouTube. All right, that's going to be kind of a slow process, but that's one of our goals. You will get to access my movie Icon, Deconstructing the Archetypes of the Ancients, as well as one of my other new videos that is not available for public view, which is In the Name of God. We're going to get guest writers to provide articles. That's in the works, as well as just a bunch of new stuff. There's just a lot of new stuff that is going to be content that will be exclusive to the webpage. So please do go sign up for this. You know, you can get a free membership, but you only get access for now, or you can get a 6-month trial membership, or 6 months free with a 1-year membership. How's that? Anyway, justenergyradio.com. And Ed, are you back? I'm guessing he's not back, so I'm just going to keep talking about this stuff. Let's see what else is going on. Well, I think this whole thing with this polio virus, I mean, I find it hard to believe that the government knowingly would allow a contaminated product to go out and basically infect everyone. And it just doesn't say anything about their quality control, that they weren't able to particularly isolate which lots and which companies were producing the contaminated material, you know, unless they just really didn't care and were just putting out stuff to put out stuff. And it just makes you wonder how rampant was the polio in the first place at that point in time, that they needed to create a vaccine to take care of it. But then that just became, you know, a bigger problem than the problem it was before. But that's what seems like happens with contemporary medicine anyway, is that they give you a drug for something, but that creates something else. Then they have to give you a drug for that, which creates something else. versus just taking care of yourself, and then you don't have to take the drugs in the first place. Like that whole relationship with antibiotics, I find fascinating and never would have made a correlation between people getting certain diseases like polio. I don't know what else would fall into that category, because the virus crosses the intestinal lining. And, there's antibiotics that will kill all of the good bacteria, like the acidophilus that you get in yogurt and, that they advertise on TV, for good gut health. But, even if you don't take antibiotics as just part of the course, you can still kill all of that good bacteria by eating really crappy food, like a lot of sugar, a lot of carby food, alcohol. Anything that's high in carbohydrate will kill bacteria in the gut. Or the way I like to think of it, it's kind of like it's feeding the weeds and not the grass. He's good now. Okay, so I guess we have Ed back. So any commentary on what I've been saying, Ed?
Yeah, I didn't hear it. I was talking to your engineer about the technical issues.
Okay, well, I was just going on and on and on about probiotics and antibiotics. I was just on a little platform thing.
Oh, good. Everybody needs to hear that. They don't hear it from the mainstream, and so talk about it every chance you get. Acidophilus, yabba dabba doo.
That's right. So what does all of this have to do with JFK? We're talking about vaccines in Louisiana and then JFK dying, and I'm not really getting a connection here.
Well, we haven't made the connection yet.
Well, that's why I'm just throwing it out there so you can.
Okay. Well, they had this thing called communism, They had this island called Cuba. Yeah.
No way.
Russian nuclear missiles coming into Cuba pointed at the United States. Well, Russians aren't all that bad. We had nuclear tipped missiles in Turkey pointed at Moscow, and the Russians said, this is making us a little nervous, like 30 minutes to incineration. We'd like you to remove those missiles from Turkey. And JFK says, sure, I'll do that. And he tells the military to move the missiles, and they won't move them. And so the Russians say, okay, well, you want to see what it feels like to have somebody point a nuclear missile at you? We'll do it. We'll bring them into Cuba. And then we'll have our negotiations. Okay, so in 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis happened. So you have to realize that New Orleans is not all about crawfish and jazz and French food and stuff. It's the major port of the largest river in the United States. Okay, it is the commercial gateway to the food supply of Central America, right? That's where the coffee and the bananas and the sugar comes from, okay? So the politics of what goes on in Central America is very important to the economy of New Orleans. And when the embargo gets slapped on Cuba, thanks to Mr. Rockefeller, New Orleans loses 25% of its trade. Well, that's like Detroit losing 25% of car sales. I mean, it's big money. And people like Ochsner, who has built his hospital, frankly, with CIA money, and has flags from every country in Central and South America out in front of his hospital so that the oligarchy and leaders of those countries will jump on a jet plane and come to New Orleans for their medical treatment. They won't have to develop their own decent medical care system down there. Ochsner's whole business model is take care of the rich in Central and South America. And now if you got Fidel Castro and Che Guevara going around Central and South America, fomenting revolutions and overthrowing this practically free labor system they've got. It threatens the entire economy of New Orleans, and it particularly threatens Ochsner's medical empire. So these people, and the CIA loves to recruit people like this. They like to get people who have a horse in the race, if you will, that really have something to lose if the commies win. And so, and Ochsner's got this 40-year history of secret assignments for the military. And they are looking at this from the late 1962, early 63 perspective. And they say, you know, this guy Castro has got to go. We've got to get rid of him. This is when they start ramping up the stuff that was exposed during the Church Committee hearings about how to kill Castro. And the CIA sets up a liaison with the mob, and which is called Operation Mongoose. And they start doing everything imaginable to try to kill Castro, one of which is an injectable cancer agent. They want to be able to give cancer to Castro because everybody believes you can't give anybody cancer in the first place. So they'll just blame it on his cigar. And the United States won't get in trouble with the Soviet Union for killing Castro when that's exactly what happened or was supposed to happen. And so what happens on this, we're now entering 1963, early 1963. And there's another limb on this story that intersects with it. There's this young gal down in, a young woman down in Florida who, when she was maybe 13, a middle schooler, she watched her grandmother die of cancer. And it was a very difficult experience for her, but she resolved that what she wanted to do with her life was be the person who found the cure for cancer. She wanted to knock out cancer. And so she throws her heart and soul into this when she's in high school and starts doing her own cancer experiments. She starts winning all kind of awards, and she gets money from the AMA and help from local doctors and help from local radiologists and stuff. And by the time she's a senior in high school, she is giving lung cancer to mice in 7 days, which is faster than they're able to do it at the National Cancer Institute. And it just so happens in March of that year, which is 61, the American Cancer Society is holding its national press briefing in St. Petersburg, Florida, which is right up the road from the little town of Bradenton where this gal lives. And she decides, lots of moxie here, she decides to crash the press briefing armed with her high school press pass and bring in her notes of her experiments and show them to the American Cancer Society. Well, she does this. I mean, she bursts in and she's like the only young female in the room, and it's pretty obvious that she, quote, doesn't belong there, and they're getting ready to throw her out. They call security and stuff. And one of the women at the head table says, well, wait a second, who is that gal? I mean, why is she here? Why would somebody barge in on this meeting, And so they go over and talk to her for a minute, and they say, well, we'll talk to you at lunch. You can stay for the time being. And at lunch, she has lunch with Harold Deal, who's a former dean of the University of Minnesota Medical School, who at the time is the vice president of research for the American Cancer Society. And she tells him what she's been doing. And he says, young lady, are you serious? Because nobody is doing that in 7 days. And she said, well, here are my notes. You're welcome to look at my notes. My lab is 20 miles down the road. I'll be happy to show you my lab and introduce you to my mentor and stuff like that. And you can decide whether or not this is real. At any rate, so this guy Deal picks up the telephone, calls his buddy, Dr. Alton Ochsner. He says, Alton, get down here, man. And there's somebody I need to introduce you to. And so Ochsner says he'll be down in 2 days. And so on Sunday, he shows up with this other guy. These are all 6-year-old guys in baggy gray suits and stuff. And they get in the car and they drive back to Judy's high school, where they look at her laboratory and they review her notes and her slides, and they talk to her faculty advisor, who's a physicist and stuff. And they say, well, what you told us is true. You're really doing what you said you were doing, and you have no idea how dangerous this is. We're shutting down your lab. You know, you're doing this in a high school with no security. Yeah, and this is level 4 kind of work, you know. So, but you're coming with us. We're going to train you. So as soon as you get graduated here in another month or two, we're going to bring you up to Buffalo, New York, and we're going to put you in this program at the Roswell Park Cancer Institute. We're going to put you in Dr. Moore's laboratory. He runs the place. And we're going to train you how to handle cancer-causing viruses. So this is how Judy Very gets involved in the cancer work. This is how she gets introduced to Dr. Alton Ochsner. And so what happens is the phone rings in March or April, I guess it is, April of 1963. Ochsner's on the phone and says, and Judy's at the University of Florida at the time. She's doing secret experiments for these cancer guys because they have questions they want to ask and they don't want to ask them in public. I mean, let me give you an example here. This SV40 is now in everybody's blood, right, because of the polio vaccine. If you put that person in front of an X-ray machine and push play, will the radiation from the X-ray machine trigger the cancer?
Think
that one through for a minute. Maybe, and that threatens the entire use of X-ray in American medicine.
Okay, but wait. But now I have to ask a question. So when you go through those things, those new things at the airport, aren't they kind of X-ray?
They're very mild, and I'm not defending those things, but they're not nearly what the old X-ray machines used to be. Okay. And so the question, and they're asking this question in the early 60s, is the generation of X-ray equipment we're using now capable of triggering the cancer to start the tumor process? Okay. And Judy is in the University of Florida. Her tuition is paid for. Her room and board is paid for. She's got access to the radiation equipment. She's got access to live human melanoma cells. She's producing monthly reports, and she's sending them into New Orleans for Ochsner's review. Okay? This is the deal. This is the quid pro quo. She's doing the secret research and giving them the data so they can get the research done without having to do it in public. And so they call her up and say, hey, Judy, you're a sophomore now. How would you like to skip the last 2 years of college and start medical school in the fall? We'll let you in. We'll pay your room and board. We'll pay your tuition. We'll give you a stipend. There's just one little project that we need your help with this summer, and you'll be working under the wing of that wonderful cancer researcher, Dr. Mary Sherman. Would you like to do this, Judy? Well, of course she does. And that's her dream job, and she gets to skip 2 years of college, start medical school, have everything paid for. The skids are greased. She is now within striking distance of being that cancer researcher she wanted to be and finding the cure for cancer. So she signs on and she says yes. And he says, I'll see you the second week of May. Well, Judy comes into New Orleans early, and she's running around shooting her mouth off, and they got to get somebody in there to babysit her. She's 19 years old. I mean, she's never been out of little old Bradenton, Florida, except for that summer she went up to Buffalo. And she's in there shooting off her mouth, getting in all kind of trouble and stuff. And they need somebody to come in and get a hold of her and show her where her apartment is, get her lined up with her cover job that they've lined up for her, so she'll be able to go clock in and then sneak out and go do this research and then come back and clock out and all that kind of stuff. And they've got all this lined up in advance, and they send in this ex-Marine with intelligence training to be her babysitter, bodyguard, and show her where everything is in New Orleans and take care of her and be a logistical support person for this project. They haven't told her what the project is. This project is, they've been getting back, they started looking for weaker versions of this SV40 virus. They keep getting back stronger and stronger versions. And now with this Castro thing going on, they decide to weaponize this virus to create a biological weapon to kill Fidel Castro. And they need somebody who's got exactly Judy's skill set to stand there and kill the mice and cut out the tumors and grind them up and make the slides and prepare everything through the cell-free filtrates and stuff and bring it back to Dr. Mary Sherman to review and then sneak back to her job. And so they send in this bodyguard to take care of her, and this bodyguard's name is Lee Harvey Oswald.
So and there's records for this that we were able to find, that you were able to find, that there was this connection to Oswald to this girl?
Well, let me give you a couple of examples. Lee Oswald and Judy Very, or Judith Very Baker, as her married name becomes that summer, both start jobs at the Riley Coffee Company on May 10th. They both get referred from the same employment agency. They start on the same day. In a subsidiary, a week later, Lee transfers over to the parent company. Judy winds up being the secretary for the ex-FBI agent who runs this subsidiary, who happens to be the founder of a right-wing propaganda mill by the name of Inca with Dr. Alton Oshner. And we have the pay stubs, we have the W-2s, we have the letters from the employment agencies. And if you don't know by now, Oswald was a spook. He was working for the CIA, being paid through the FBI. And he's part of Operation Mongoose, which was joint CIA and mob. Oswald is from the mob in New Orleans. And actually, we have a witness, and her video is on my website called drmarysmonkey.com, but spell out Dr. D-O-C-T-O-R. This is Anna Lewis. Anna was married to David Lewis. David Lewis worked for Guy Bannister, who's just about everybody who looks at this says, oh, that was Oswald's control officer, okay? And they, the Lewises and Judy and Lee, all go over to the 500 Club, which is the headquarters of Carlos Marcello, the guy that runs the mafia in New Orleans. And they meet Lee Oswald, Judy, Anna, and David. They meet with Clay Shaw and Carlos Marcello. And she has got that on the video, which is on the website I just gave you. So there's a lot of pieces to this that we have documentation to. This is a very secret operation, so people don't leave a lot of casual stuff around. But Judy knew that she was getting into really deep territory, and what she was doing was either highly illegal or very important. And she started saving all of her things, like her W-2s from 1963. Which all have her correct addresses on them and stuff.
I remember watching a show, it was a long time ago, about a connection to, I think it was New Orleans. It was to somewhere back east with Lee Harvey Oswald and his secret lover girlfriend. So is one of these women his girlfriend that was in this show, or was that somebody completely different?
No, that's the same person. They become involved after several months. You know, this didn't start off with Lee Oswald's girlfriend getting involved in this cancer thing. He was, basically her bodyguard, caretaker, and all that other stuff, and they were at each other's elbow. I mean, they'd ride the public bus to work in the morning. They'd pick up Lee, and a couple of blocks later, they'd pick up Judy. They'd sit together. She was faking his punching him out when he wasn't there on the time cards. And one of the interesting things that you get in the Warren Commission on this, you see there's this guy who says he was Oswald's supervisor for a while, but they don't tell you how long. And he said, oh, he was a horrible employee. He was off campus when he was clocked in. I could never find him, blah, blah, blah. And he says all this terrible stuff about Lee. He's not being interviewed, by the way. This is all in a written affidavit. And I'm reading this and I'm saying, well, gee, if he's this terrible employee and you're really his supervisor, why are you approving his time cards? And then you say, well, let's go look at Lee Oswald's time cards. They're not in the Warren Commission volumes. They got the dental records of Jack Ruby's mother, but they don't have the...
Whatever your child needs, you'll be right by his side. So isn't it good to know that the Children's Hospital, ranked best in the nation by U.S. News & World Report and Parents Magazine, is right by your side? The Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. Visit chop.edu/yourside.
Time cards of the guy being accused of killing the president at this place that he was working under the direction of the ex-FBI agent. Okay? So we eventually find these things. And the time cards were given to the FBI, and the FBI gave them to the Warren Commission, and the Warren Commission hid them in a file and did not publish them. And we found them in the file. And when you look at Lee Oswald's time cards, and there's a lot of interesting detail to say about this, but the basic thing you see is that they're all approved by one of two people. They either have a little M with a circle around it. That's Mr. Moynihan approving it. He was the executive vice president, and he was Judy's boss. And when he was not around, Judy herself initialed Oswald's time cards. So if you're a competent investigator and you're looking at these time cards, the first thing you're going to say is, whose initials are these? Let's get them in here. I want to ask them some questions. Well, they don't want the Warren Commission asking Judy any questions. I mean, it's why this whole thing with their background checks were especially handled by Moynihan, because they didn't want to find the word Russia in Lee's background, and they didn't want to find the word cancer in Judy's background. Okay, so all this stuff is done. We have these. Judy has a wonderful book, by the way, which is called Me and Lee, How I Came to Know, Love, and Lose Lee Harvey Oswald. Those time cards are in that book, as are tons of other, all the employment records and all that other stuff. So, and that's a book that I was involved in editing. Judy's the author. I was one of the editors for Trine Day. And it lays this thing out chapter and verse, day by day, and tells the last 6 months of when she was with Lee Oswald in New Orleans, and then how they stayed in contact all the way up to, she winds up talking to Lee on the telephone 2 days before the assassination. And he knows he's being set up. He told her on July 29th, that these guys are serious about killing Kennedy, and I think they're going to blame it on me, because they're asking me to do all this stuff in August that's going to make me look like a communist. So I'd be the perfect patsy. At any rate, so those two books, Dr. Mary's Monkey and Me and Lee, are almost companion pieces. They're different style books, but they talk about an overlapping subject here. And I really recommend somebody who wants to get into the subject to read both the books. I'd start by reading Me and Lee.
Okay. So, all right. So we've connected Lee to this whole thing. I guess one of the questions that I have is, they went and developed this virus, but I'm assuming that their plan to go after Castro or infect Castro failed, or they didn't do it. Do you know which is the case?
Or it never was really their plan in the first place. I mean, one of the problems when you deal with these spooks is they don't tell the people who are working for them what they're really doing. They lie to them. Okay? All they want them to do is to do what they're asking them to do. They're not really interested in telling them what they're really doing or why they're doing it. Okay? So what they're told, what Judy and Lee are told, is the whole purpose of weaponizing this virus is to be able to kill Fidel Castro, to prevent World War III, noble cause, all that stuff, right? And they kill thousands of mice. They start killing monkeys, South American monkeys, African monkeys, and they're working their way up the evolutionary ladder until they get to the end of August. And Ostrin's getting really impatient. I mean, he's had them kill 500 mice a day at that point in time. And they're flushing the stuff down the toilet over in Mary Sherman's apartment building. And so what happens is that the big question is, can you inject this into a human, give the human cancer, and will the human die? That's what they need to know. Right. And so the question is, where do you get a human that you can kill and nobody's going to miss? Well,
I can give a list.
Well, how about,
this is in the 60s. Never mind.
How about death row in Angola Penitentiary in southeast Louisiana? We got this Cuban up there who's been convicted of rape and murder, and he's on death row, and nobody's going to miss him if he gets transferred to a mental hospital, and we'll just inject him over at the mental hospital and see if it kills him. And by the way, let's get another patient or two while we're doing it, so we have some redundancy on this and make sure it kills all of them. And they pick a date at random for this. They pick August 29th, 1963, to bring the biological weapon up to Jackson. Now, Jackson's about 4 hours north of New Orleans. So that's 4 hours up, 4 hours back. That's 8 hours. You got a couple hours of being there. It's a 11-hour trip, okay? So this is not casual. They're deliberately going up there at this time. And what they forgot to do was read the newspaper, because what they're planning on doing, the van is going to leave the penitentiary, all right? And it's going to drive to the mental hospital. That's about 45 minutes. So they're going to go wait in front of the courthouse by the payphone. Remember, there were no cell phones back then. It's payphones. They're going to wait in front of the payphone, and when the payphone rings, that will tell them that the prisoner has left the penitentiary, and they will drive out to a rendezvous spot on the highway, and as the van goes past, they'll get in line with their black Cadillac behind the van and pull up at the entrance to the mental hospital, and they'll get waved in with the prisoner in the van and the biological weapon and these people in the black Cadillac, and they'll all go in like a convoy. Okay, that's the game plan. And so they're going to go wait over at Clinton, Louisiana, which is about 12 miles down the road from Jackson. And Clinton's the county seat. It's got the courthouse there and stuff, payphone out in front. And this is end of August in South Louisiana. It is hot in South Louisiana in the end of August. Yeah. Right? They are expecting this square in front of the courthouse to be deserted. Right? They're going to pull up under an oak tree by the payphone and wait. They get there, and what they did not realize was that the day before this, August 28th, 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech in Washington. And because of that, the Congress on Racial Equality, which is a national organization run out of the University of Chicago, has planned black voter registration drives all across the South to move on the heels and the momentum of Dr. King's speech. So what happens is there they are on the 29th of August. The blacks are in a line trying to register to vote on one side. The angry whites with their arms crossed are standing on the other side of the square. This poor guy with a badge on by the name of John Manchester standing there in the middle. He's the town marshal. He's just hoping there's not going to be any violence or problem. And he's keeping an eye on everything. And into the scene drives the black Cadillac. And Manchester looks at the Cadillac and he says, "Who are these guys? I mean, is this media, press, government officials? What?" So he goes over, pulls his badge, says, "I'd like to see some identification, please." And the guy driving the car pulls out his driver's license and says, "I am Clay Shaw of the International Trademark."
Okay.
The guy sitting next to Clay Shaw is a little bit easier to identify because he had an orange wig and grease paint eyebrows on. But from the back seat, this 23-year-old white kid gets out and goes and gets in line with the blacks to register to vote, because he wants to see if they'll let him register just because he's white, even though he doesn't live in the area. And he gets all the way up there and he signs the ledger, Lee Harvey Oswald. Okay. Now the essence, the Oliver Stone JFK movie, Jim Garrison, all that stuff. The essence of that was Garrison had associated Clay Shaw with Oswald. And Shaw said, no, I never knew Oswald. He's lying through his teeth. And Garrison tried to convict him of that, but the federal government wouldn't let him. And so what happens is when the House Select Committee on Assassinations comes along in the 1970s, they subpoena this John Manchester, town marshal from Clinton, to come up to Washington and testify, which he does. And he tells them the whole story. And they stamp it secret. For 16 years, the Congress of the United States knew that Clay Shaw drove Lee Harvey Oswald into Clinton, Louisiana, just down the road from Jackson. And they kept it secret from the media and from the public. Okay, we only found out about it after the Oliver Stone movie triggered the JFK Records Act. So what you've got here is the story keeps unfolding, and you get more and more pieces. Well, Judy, she signed up to find the cure for cancer. She didn't sign up for murder. She's like really doesn't like what's going on here. And she writes a note of protest to Ochsner, who said, this is, don't put anything in writing. This is a top secret national security project, right? And she writes a protest letter saying this is unethical and everything else. Ochsner blows up. He says, you're not going to medical school in the fall. You're leaving New Orleans, and you're lucky you're leaving New Orleans with your teeth in your mouth. Unfortunately, there's one more thing we need you to do. We need you to go back up to Jackson and do the blood test to see if the cancer weapon worked. And Lee Oswald on August 31st drives Judy back up from New Orleans all the way up to Jackson, 4 hours up, 4 hours back, picks up an employee of the mental hospital, so they've got an employee in the car. So, this is a hospital for the criminally insane, right? So they got a big fence around it. They got guards at the gate and everything else. You don't just walk in to see Aunt Sally up there. You have to go through the security measures. And they go up there, and Judy does the blood test, which she was trained to do up at in Buffalo, New York, at the Roswell Park Cancer Institute. And she says, this guy definitely has cancer. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. And so she is then sent out of town, and Oswald, who that month was doing all this crazy stuff, leafleting and acting like he was a communist and stuff, which is all a charade. But he's finished doing that. He just goes home and sits on his front porch and reads, because he's just waiting for the prisoner to die. Because the moment the prisoner dies, he's being sent to Mexico to deliver the biological weapon to a CIA contact so they can get it into Cuba and kill Castro. It's a harebrained scheme, but this is what these people were told. And so it's on September 25th is when Oswald heads for Mexico. And there's more to that than I can get into here. But that is what happens when Lee comes back from Mexico. He does not come back to New Orleans. He goes to Dallas. And Judy's in Florida, and David Ferry, who works for the mafia in addition to the CIA, he's part of that mongoose crowd. He's arranged for them to be able to talk for free on the mob's sports betting long distance lines. And so, Judy's talking to Lee a couple times a week all throughout the fall. And, Lee has been telling her since July, these guys are going to kill Kennedy. And Lee has actually penetrated the plot, if you will, to kill Kennedy. And one of the reasons Kennedy does not get killed in Chicago 2 weeks earlier is an informant by the name of Lee tipped off the Secret Service that there was a plot to kill Kennedy up there. And they actually busted the people, but they didn't do anything to them. And you got this whole thing with the training camp down in Louisiana. Lee is spying on that. Lee's a spy. And what when you
So
realize,
is that one of the reasons why they decided to make him a patsy and then eliminate him? Because he knew too much? Could connect too many dots?
well, not only that, he knows all about the biological weapon. He knows all about the assassination plot. Can you imagine what he could have said if he got into a courtroom?
Mm-hmm.
You know, he would have blown the lid off the whole thing. You know, he knew too much. And he was supposed to be killed on the 22nd, in my opinion. You know, they only had to pull this, you know, shoot him in the police station of all places, you know, on Sunday morning because they messed up on Friday afternoon. And you know, Lee was a smart guy and he knew they were coming after him. But, you know, Lee didn't kill anybody on November 22nd. He was on the second floor lunchroom at the time Kennedy was shot. There was a witness with him at the time. She never testified because she was never asked to testify. But she was giving him change for the Coke machine. Her name's Miss Reed. And Lee was already in the Texas Theater building at the time that Tippit was shot. There was another guy who was a doppelganger, a lookalike of Lee, came into the building. He went up to the balcony. So the police came. They arrested Lee, who was on the ground floor. Another group of police arrested the guy in the balcony, took him out the back, and let him go. You know, and this is all now known stuff. I mean, parts in this book, parts in that book. But when you start to pull this together and synthesize it, you realize that it was just a horrible plot to do this. And one of the things I've gotten into recently is a fellow by the name of Chauncey Holt. Chauncey was part of Mongoose. He was Meyer Lansky's accountant. He killed people for the mob. And he worked for the CIA. He was a pilot for the CIA, and he was a forger. He's a fabulous artist and a forger. And he made the phony Secret Service IDs for Dallas on November 22nd and delivered them to a pickup truck behind the Texas School Book Depository. I mean, there's just so much of this when you get into it.
But let me ask this question because we have like not quite 15 minutes. Let's say 10 minutes left. Okay, so we have this biological weapon that was created in New Orleans that was designed to kill Castro. And we know that there were the issues, you know, Bay Pigs, blah, 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 blah. But why kill Kennedy? In all of your digging, did that come up as part of a bigger plot? And, you know, killing Castro is just one piece of it?
I think that's a pretty good summary of it. Because the people that were after Kennedy were the radical right and the CIA and the big money people. You know, it is a cabal of people who had the professionals below them do it. And one of the things that Lee Oswald was going over to Mary Sherman's apartment. Okay. We have witnesses that. We have witnesses who lived a couple of doors down from Mary Sherman, who knew Lee Oswald from middle school, who saw him over there. He would go into the apartment next to them and flush the toilet 20 or 30 times in a row, day after day for about a month. You know, I mean, what's that? They're disposing of something. They're disposing of the biological materials that were the byproduct of the biological weapon. And then when Mary Sherman gets murdered, we have J. Edgar Hoover telling his agents, particularly the special agent in charge of the New Orleans office, do not investigate this murder. This is a local murder. We don't have any jurisdiction. Well, hey, I figure out where the linear particle accelerator is, and it's in the infectious disease laboratory of the U.S. Public Health Service Hospital, which is federal property.
Wait, there's a linear accelerator in a health unit?
The U.S. Public Health Service Hospital, which was built on the river during World War I to deal with wounded soldiers coming back from Europe, has about 13 buildings on its campus. Okay, one of the buildings in the back was not being used for anything, and so they hung up a sign called the Infectious Disease Laboratory just to keep people out, and they installed a linear particle accelerator in there so that they had a source of a gamma ray radiation that they could use to mutate the virus, looking for initially the vaccine, but later ramping it up for the biological weapon.
Well, I mean, I get that part, but I always look for the, linear accelerator at my local hospital. I mean, it doesn't even make sense why in a hospital research facility, anything having to do with medical, they would need one of those and why it would ever get approved. Just my commentary.
Okay. Well, first of all, it was not approved through the normal channels, right? This is all the CIA handling it through back channels. But at the same time, and I have this in an article in Time Magazine, MD Anderson also got one. But the one MD Anderson got has clinical access features, because when they go in to burn out a tumor nowadays, they don't call them linear particle accelerators anymore, but that's what they are, okay? Those big radiation machines that burn out the tumors. And the one in New Orleans did not have, and we found the guy who installed it, it did not have clinical access features. It had a platinum pyramid that they shot the beam at, and the platinum pyramid split the beam into equal doses, and those sub-beams were sent into chambers that were lined with asbestos, and that's where they put the test tubes and stuff. So, and this is all, between Dr. Mary's Monkey, which is about 400 pages, and me and Lee, which is about 600 pages. There's 1,000 pages of explaining all this stuff with diagrams and all that other stuff in there. But what happens essentially is that Lee gets sent to Mexico, and they actually fly him around all day on the 25th. Leave him in Houston where he can get on the bus, and right before he gets on the bus, they say, "Oh, give us that old batch of sauce you got there. We got a new batch for you." And they hand Lee the chicken soup, and Lee takes the chicken soup to Mexico, and they keep the biological weapon in Sugar Land, Texas, where the Birchers are. Okay, so now, doing this on the radio, I'm always happy to talk on the radio, but it's a little bit like a drink from a fire hose. It's a lot of moving parts in this. It's why I've been on Coast to Coast for 14 hours. I'm the only person that I know that's been on there that much. But at any rate, that's except for the host, of course. That's the basic layout of this, and Lee gets set up as the patsy. Lee knows Jack Ruby. Judy met Jack Ruby at David Ferry's apartment in New Orleans. They all went out to Antoine's and had dinner together, with Clay Shaw. I mean, all this stuff that Garrison stumbled upon was real, but Garrison didn't have the key of the biological weapon to figure out how it all fit together, because the relationship with Ferry and Shaw and the hospital and the people, Shaw's boss, Shaw's boss was Lloyd Cobb. Lloyd Cobb is the founder of the trademark. Well, he's the major landowner in this parish or county, if you will, where the hospital is. And he's has all this stuff going on with the CIA. When Chauncey comes into town as part of Mongoose, he's delivering weapons, customized, modified, silenced machine guns type weapons. And he's meeting with Lloyd Cobb about the delivery. And Chauncey comes out of that meeting at the International Trade Mart, and the cameras are rolling out in front, photographing and filming Lee Oswald handing out his Fair Play for Cuba committee things. And Chauncey walks into the field of view of the camera, and they get a picture of him with Lee Oswald in front of the International Trade Mart after he just came out of the meeting with Clay Shaw's boss, and he's working for the CIA at that point in time. At any rate, there's a lot to this. There's a lot of moving parts, and I'm sure everybody's tilt meters have been going off for a while. But I encourage you to get these two books and just take your time with them and read them slowly and with an open mind, and ask all the logical questions, and most of them will be answered in the books as they go on, because it's as far as I'm concerned, this story, I never set out to get involved in the JFK assassination. I didn't want to.
But you didn't answer the most important question.
What's that?
Who killed JFK? If it wasn't Oswald, who killed him? Isn't that the most important question?
No, the most important point is the fact that it wasn't Oswald. I could give you a list of names of people who are the likely shooters, but they're just shooters, I mean, what's funny, once you start to learn about this game and you realize they call it the Sixth Floor Museum. They don't call it the JFK Assassination Museum. JFK was not shot from the sixth floor of the book depository. He was shot from the Daltex building and the grassy knoll, right? But they set up the fake sniper's nest on the sixth floor, and that's all they got up there, and Oswald was on the second floor at the time. I mean, they never would have convicted Oswald of killing Tippit. They never would have convicted him of killing Kennedy. It was J. Edgar Hoover himself, who's 1 hour and 15 minutes after Kennedy was shot, said, "We've got our man. Stop the investigation. I don't want to hear anything other than Oswald did it." That's what he tells to Gordon Shanklin, who's the FBI agent in charge of Dallas. So, and we've got this J. Edgar Hoover memo telling his guys not to investigate the Mary Sherman murder. On page 2 of that, there's something that says somebody's name was found in Mary Sherman's address book. Well, why tell the head of the FBI this? Because the name's 6 letters long and it's redacted, like OSWALD. And I got 2 witnesses that saw Oswald in the building, one of them who saw him in Mary Sherman's apartment and who knows that Mary Sherman telephoned Lee Oswald.
So do you think they got rid of her because she knew too much, or do you think there was some kind of an accident and they just disposed the body in her apartment?
Well, those are really good questions. In the book, I call it an industrial accident, but the question is, was the accident accidental? All right. And the problem I have with them burning off her arm to murder her is there's a lot easier ways of killing somebody. They could have just shot her in her parking lot and grabbed her purse and called it a robbery. Okay, they didn't have to burn off her arm. And with burning off her arm... Well, and
then taking her out of work, so it can't really be a work accident thing.
Right, but they also took her off of federal property, so the FBI didn't have to investigate it. That laboratory was the Medical Manhattan Project. It was a secret U.S. government laboratory, and having her get electrocuted in that laboratory exposes the laboratory. Because the moment you find the doctor with her arm burned off in this laboratory with this machine looks like it was out of a science fiction movie, somebody's going to say, "What were you guys doing in here? And why were you doing it?" And the answer is, we were mutating cancer-causing monkey viruses because we just mass inoculated the entire population of the United States with a cancer-causing virus, including your children. And that's what they did not want the public to know.
Crazy. But you know what? On that note, we're going to wrap up. So if someone wants to get a copy of Dr. Mary's Monkey, blah, 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 Lee Harvey, JFK, Emerging Global Epidemics, where can they go?
Well, you can go to your bookstore at Amazon or to my website. Amazon's got it in hardcover, softcover, audio, Kindle, all that stuff. That's probably the simplest way to find it. And right on the page where you see Dr. Mary's Monkey is also me and Lee, how I came to know, love, and lose Lee Harvey Oswald. So you can get all that stuff right there in that same place. They package them together and stuff.
And so if they buy them off your website, do they come from you and do you sign them?
Yes, from my website, which is Dr. Mary's Monkey, but spell out doctor. All the books are signed by me personally, and they're shipped from here by me. I've got about 15 hours worth of video background, interviews with witnesses, interviews on the whole contamination of the polio vaccine, interviews with me on various shows. So you can sort of see if I say the same thing on all radio shows or not, At any rate, so the books are very available. You can, of course, also get them on eBay and But if you want to order them secretly, you can go into your local store and have they're in the catalog. Just have them order it.
Great. Well, there's the music, which means we need to go. So thank you so much for coming on. This was really interesting. So thank you.
It's great talking to you.
All right. Bye, Ed.
Good night, Dr. Rita.
That's Edward Haslam. His book is Dr. Mary's Monkey. And next week, we're doing something. All right. Maybe not. There we go. Oh, we have L.A. Marzulli coming on talking about the Nephilim. Till next time, I'm Dr. Rita Louise. This is Just Energy Radio. Be blessed.
Join host Dr. Rita Louise each week at this time for Just Energy Radio. Point your browser to www.justenergyradio.com for more show information and to contact Dr. Rita. Until next time, remember, it's all just energy.